Hello, and welcome back to The Canadians. Here at The Canadians, we attempt to understand Canada's contrarians. We believe contrarians are sometimes the only people holding valuable information the rest of society desperately needs. Today's guest is Professor Eric Kaufmann. Eric is a political scientist and professor of politics at the University of Buckingham, and one of the few academics who has tried to define what people mean when they talk about woke as an ideology, rather than just a label or a term of criticism. In this conversation, I wanted to slow things down and start at the beginning. What is woke exactly? Is it just a loose collection of ideas, or is it something more coherent? How does it differ from older traditions on the left, like the class-based politics many Canadians would associate with figures like Jack Layton? And how much influence does it actually have in Canadian institutions and public life? Eric's answer is not a simple one. He describes what we're seeing less as a traditional political ideology and more as a kind of moral or cultural movement, one that makes certain groups and ideas sacred, establishes strong social taboos, and increasingly shapes the norms of public life. What makes his perspective interesting is that he doesn't see this primarily as a top-down conspiracy or a coordinated political project, but as something that has grown more organically with real moral motivations behind it, even as it produces tensions and conflicts in the culture. This ended up being a more probing and exploratory conversation than some of my recent episodes. Rather than simply walking through Eric's work, I also brought in some of my own questions and intuitions about how these ideas have changed over time and where they seem to be showing up in Canadian life today. The result, I think, is a conversation that tries to clarify terms, test assumptions, and better understand a set of ideas that are often talked about, but not always carefully defined. Professor Kaufmann is the author of several books on these topics, including Taboo and The Third Awakening. I'll include links to his work in the show notes. Here's my conversation with Eric Kaufmann. Well, Professor Kaufmann, welcome to the Canadians. It's a real pleasure to get to sit down and talk with you today.
Great to be here, Jared. Thanks for inviting me.
Oh, it's a real honor. So, I've been following your work for years. I've found it fascinating. I think you really came into my attention when I saw that you're kind of one of the first academics actually teaching courses around woke as being treated as a proper ideology. You kind of place it amongst socialism or communism or any other ideology. And that kind of fascinated me because that was kind of my entry point about a decade ago, growing up on the left. And when I started reaching across the divide to listen to people who I normally wasn't listening to, one of the most persistent and consistent claims people were making was that there was more to this woke claim than people on the left were considering. And I found the good faith actors that were making that claim. When I started examining it, I started believing that it was worthwhile to look at that. But I'm hoping maybe today we can take a few steps back from where your work normally is, because I think a lot of your discussions are, is woke peaked? Is it dead?
Right.
I'm kind of maybe thinking if maybe we can almost start at the beginning, because I'm kind of hoping maybe still to reach new listeners and maybe people. I think most of my life is spent in left of center cultural circles, and I just noticed that there's still much skepticism when the word woke comes up or ideology. I think most people still feel that it's just a term that kind of captures the natural excesses of the left, but isn't necessarily reflective of some coherent ideology. And so, maybe for listeners who are still a little skeptical when they hear that claim, but are maybe open to listening to new information right now. And Canada is, I think, a bit unique in where we're at compared to other countries in the world. And so I thought maybe we could have a Canadian-based conversation, maybe aimed at just right at the beginning, how would you define wokeness as a professor teaching it?
Yeah, such a good question, because it sort of resists being named, which I think is also part, ironically, of the strategy. But I think that, in a simple sense, woke is the making sacred of historically marginalized race, gender, and sexual identity groups. Notice what that is. That's a sort of focus on a particular set of groups. So we wouldn't necessarily be interested in class, but we also wouldn't be interested in ethnic differences within racial groups, like Italians versus WASP. We wouldn't be interested in Jews versus German. And we also wouldn't be interested in skin color gradations, say light and dark-skinned, Black or Hispanic. That's not going to be of much interest. So it's only certain categories that we're focusing on: race, gender, sexuality, which you can be put in a box of one or the other. And there are the oppressed, and then there are the oppressor groups within those. So that's at the core of this. This is the identity component. But beyond that, I also think is an ideological component, which is to do with equal outcomes. And so biracial group, there should be, if it's 13% Black in the US, should be 13% Black at Harvard, 13% Black in the boardroom. So that idea of equal outcomes, which is a kind of left claim, but as applied to identity groups rather than classes or individual economic circumstance. So equal outcomes plus emotional harm protection. So protection from harmful speech that might be quote unquote traumatizing or a microaggression. And the idea there is two parts of this is what Jonathan Haidt would call the equality and the care harm moral foundations or moral intuitions underlie this ideology. And that's why, if you think about DEI, for example, equity, diversity is the equal outcomes by race. So if we don't have that, we're going to have affirmative action quotas for, admitting to university hiring, etc. I for inclusion, which is really about, to make people feel welcome, we're going to clamp down on free speech so that you don't say anything that might offend somebody, like misgendering or whatever. So that is really where speech codes and diversity statements and all that come in. So it's really, I would still define it as a cultural form of socialism in the sense that it has this broad left thrust of equalizing by demanding equal outcomes, and that we'll engineer those equal outcomes through some kind of a affirmative action. And then the sort of harm protection side, that's why it's not actually Marxism, because Marxism wasn't very interested in harm protection, but it's more of this sort of softer, less liberal, democratic socialist thing, which is also brings in that harm protection element, but it's now pushed into this therapeutic area of self-esteem and emotional safety in this sort of area, which is much more psychological. But I think it fits that quite well.
So it's often what's called safetyism, I guess, and that aspect being blended in. There's so much to unpack in what you just said there. So I want to the equal outcomes, I guess that is in contrast to there's so much to unpack there. And so how does this different, let's say, from Jack Layton socialism?
Well, I mean, your old left traditional socialism, first of all, it's more economic and class-based, and it's about unions, and it's about redistributing wealth vis-a-vis the free market. So that's a very different set of problems. And then it might, in theory, be quite okay with economic inequality as long as you have equal outcomes by race in the boardroom and sex. The orientation is a different set of categories. It's race, sex, gender, sexuality rather than class. So that's probably the main thing. Clearly equal. There's this distinction in liberalism, let's say classical liberalism, that says we should have equal opportunities and merit. So we want a level playing field to compete, but if we're going to have more South Asians as doctors and more, whites as hockey players, well, then that's reflecting different emphases in different cultures, and that's just the way it goes. Rather than trying to engineer a mirror representation in every field of the population. So there's also a difference from liberalism in the sense that woke demands, equal outcomes by race and sex, for example, whereas liberalism might say, well, we can tolerate unequal outcomes as long as we have an equal and fair process.
Okay. Yeah. And so maybe I've wanted to talk to you for years, and maybe I'll just try this on for you and you can just kind of set me straight. This is the way I'm kind of been thinking about things, and I'm not saying it's right or correct. And maybe I can stress test it with you and you can tell me where maybe I'm overreaching or where I'm not thinking about this properly. But like, I grew up on the left in the 90s, as a liberal. I was a bit activisty and was in marches and stuff. And, when people would point and say, well, you're a radical or something, we could point at the radical left. And back then it seemed like they were found down long hallways in humanities departments. But it kind of felt like, as a 90s progressive, you believed in, like you said, equality of opportunity, not equality of outcome. And so the last 10, 15 years, it feels like in Canada, we've replaced the word equality with equity all over. And at the same time, we replaced the colorblind society ideal, which is kind of summarized by being judged by the content of your character, not the color of your skin. And we replaced that with anti-racism, and queer has started to replace gay. And, it just seems that, to me, those were what used to be radical left ideas. And I feel like they've been brought into Canadian institutions and the Canadian left. And I was always waiting for this debate to happen where we could discuss whether, the merits of equity versus equality and anti-racism versus the colorblind society ideal. But it felt like the debate never happened. And then eventually it just became like you were kind of fell into, as a, you're treated like a hateful person if you even wanted to have the debate. And so that's where I'm kind of sitting. It feels like the ideas I previously associated with the radical left have become ascendant and are just now the normal values being pushed by the progressive left. But am I overreaching? Am I not reading that properly? Am I attaching? Yeah.
No, I think you're right. I mean, there's no question that the radical left ideas are hegemonic in the institutions, universities, schools, civil service, any sort of even corporate world. That on the cultural side, those ideas are dominant. Now, you may have different versions of it. You may have some that are more critical race and gender, like a really quite almost cultural Marxist talking about systems of oppression. And you might have other versions that are more kind of left liberal therapeutic about, harm to self-esteem and group trauma and all this sort of more psychotherapeutic language. But either way, they're going to be quite radical, and they're not going to represent public opinion or the median line of public opinion. The only thing I'd say, so I do think this is a story. I mean, my argument, as distinct from the arguments of some people like Chris Rufo or James Lindsay, I mean, I don't see this as necessarily a revolutionary movement. I think most of the energy is from, I guess, what you might call bleeding heart liberal, or what God's side would call suicidal empathy. It's an overreaching of certain impulses that were already there, but have and just continued to sort of ascend. The logic has continued to unfold to the point where there's diminishing returns, and there are big costs in terms of other societal values like freedom and cohesion, for example, or reason. Unlike some other people, I don't see as much of a break with the past. So, for example, I see multiculturalism, the emphasis on difference as opposed to commonality, as a kind of gateway drug to identity politics and the whole critical race gender ideology. So I don't think that classical liberalism, equal treatment was certainly wasn't the overt stated argument on the left. In the 90s, even when I was growing up in Canada, it was very much identity-based already then. And you had political correctness, which I think is essentially similar to wokeness in cancel culture, in the sense that now you didn't have a like button and you didn't have social media.
Yeah.
It was harder to cancel people. But there were episodes that occurred of what you might call a kind of woke insanity in the 90s already. University of British Columbia Political Science Department was shut down while external consultants investigated claims non-specific to any staff member of racism and sexism. And then it turned, this kind of stuff was going on during that politically correct era, which was happening when I was at university, undergraduate. So I think this was already there, but I think it hadn't yet broken out of the universities quite as much because social media wasn't there to bridge the craziness of quite a significant share of the soft social sciences and humanities already in the 90s, probably more in certain departments than others. Those ideas had yet to break into mainstream media quite as much. Uh, and then with social media, it brought the academics together with a media that was changing, that needed virality, it needed to drive emotion because it didn't have classified ads anymore. And so there was just a kind of conjunction that happens in the 2010s. But I think these ideas really, if you were in a women's studies seminar in the 1980s, it's the same kind of, emotional blackmail, ad hominem style, irrational kind of reasoning, not based on kind of Enlightenment principles and Socratic dialogue, and so I just don't think that it's as different from the past as we think.
Well, you often hear in this conversation like this slow march through the institutions followed by the fast march. Do you ascribe to that idea that you could go back to even the 60s as being kind of the seeds of these ideas? And so I imagine you can never find a true beginning, but in some ways, do you kind of ascribe to that slow march, fast march through the institutions?
Yeah, well, I think okay, there's a yes and no. I mean, I think that the argument about the march through the institutions is also a kind of it has this idea of intentionality. Like, we're going to get a beachhead in, we're going to hire our
Right.
own, we're going to take these things over. We have a plan and a vision. And yes, there undoubtedly were cultural Marxists who had that vision. Do I think that's the main reason we're here? No, I don't. And this is where I kind of disagree with people like Rufo and Lindsay, who are put more emphasis on this kind of top down intentionality. I see it as much more of a sort of disorganized, what would you call it? A kind of self organizing, peer to peer, emergent, like COVID being spread around from person to person. You hit a super spreader like a university, uh, more bottom up and more like a religious revival rather than a communist, diktat from the top plan. And so,
Right.
but there's no question that this does gradually take over institutions just by critical mass. You can look, we have surveys, for example, of academia, we can see, or of the media, we can see the share of people who are on the left, for example, amongst American academics. It goes from something like, if you take the social sciences, maybe 3-1 left to right in the mid 1960s. And by the time we get to the 2010s, it's sort of, at elite universities, it's probably over 15-20-1.
Right.
Overall, it's about 12-1. So yeah, there's definitely been a deepening of the capture of these institutions over time. I think part of it is, yes, discriminating against those who aren't on the left. Hostile environments are created which dissuade people who don't have the orthodox views from going into academia, going into media, and so on. So that's part of it. But it's also, yeah, I just think that it's a sort of bottom up process. It's not so much of a planned march through the institutions, but the net effect is the same: is that you now have almost complete capture of quite a few sectors: the charitable sector, university sector, school, certainly the running of schools and education schools, that kind of thing. So yeah. Oh,
So you see it kind of as a bottom up, but it's so effective because the people spreading these ideas just had certain places of authority. Because it seems odd to be bottom up in the sense that, like you just mentioned earlier in the conversation in Canada, where maybe our institutions aren't even reflecting the beliefs and wills of the people at this point, which kind of feels top down to the average person at that point, because it feels like only a minority of people are holding these views, yet all these institutions are pushing them forward, and it gives off that impression of being a top down feeling to
yeah.
it. But you're arguing that it's a bottom up, more decentralized, and it's just ideas floating around. But these minority viewpoints are just holding positions of power, and that's how it manages to disseminate still.
Yeah, I think there's a number of things going on. I mean, one is that people who are on the progressive left are much more interested in politics. We know from surveys that politics is a much bigger part of their identity and their meaning in their life than other Canadians, for example, or other Americans. They're far more likely to post on social media, post political content on social media, to volunteer at all levels from, school boards and all kinds of sort of local councils or, unions, for example. They're going to be represented in the union leadership. Why is that? Is it because they say, okay, we're going to take over this union? I think part of it is just that, those people are just more committed. So they are more focused, and often the committed minority will come to dominate. Yeah, they're probably selecting their friends, but equally, I think the other side doesn't really have, a way of countering their arguments and isn't able to inspire their people to join, let's say, run for union leadership on a non-political, on a ticket that does not involve Gaza, that does not involve BLM or any of these other omni-cause, symbolic crusades. They're just not going to run. So I just think there is a kind of self-selecting process. And yes, okay, so once they achieve critical mass, they'll certainly try and stack the deck in their favor. But I also think they're just more committed, and because of that, they're more organized. But we have to explain why that kind of meaning system is just that much more important. You rarely see right-wing protests. I mean, occasionally, like the trucker protest, that's extremely rare. Almost all protest activity is on the left because for them, they care more. I mean, as Richard Hanania says, the left just cares more about politics. At least that's been the case up until recently. So I just think now there's another element to this, which is that, and this is a complicated thing, that the emotional regime, where the taboos are, if you win an election, you get to make the laws. And if you attain cultural power, you get to make the norms and the taboos in the society. And those norms and the taboos used to be more conservative. You frown on someone who's divorced or gay or, a young person who's wearing their hair funny or taking drugs. A lot of the kind of conservative taboos have now fallen away, been challenged and fallen away. And they've been replaced by the progressive taboos, racism, sexism, homophobia, transphobia, etc. Those taboos are now the dominant sort of moral landscape, emotional landscape, background music of society. Those are the tripwires, and everybody, regardless of their politics, even conservatives, have to play within those red lines. So that gives a lot of power to the cultural left, and by the way, this is a cultural thing. So you can make fun of somebody's class or their can call them a hick. That's not going to get you canceled. However, if you say something that is perceived as racist or sexist, then you will be canceled. Your reputation, you're cast out of society. So that gives a huge the emergence of the anti-racism taboo. Of course, we need norms against these things, but they very quickly become boundless without any guardrails and expand in scope because they're so powerful. You can make someone shut up. A small number of activists who point the finger and call somebody a racist for opposing, let's say, affirmative action. If someone says, I think that's wrong, and you say, oh, you're a racist, that shuts them up. So there's a tremendous amount of cultural power that is wielded even by small numbers of people. And I think so that's partly where they're able to neutralize even small numbers of people in something like the police force, where most of the rank and file officers would not be woke. The small number of people who can wield this charge of racism can shut up the entire department. Now, in the universities where probably most academics are woke, are probably receptive to that, then you can do it a different way. You can do it any way you want, but in either way, I think that the existence of these taboos means that the small number, even if it's a small number of people, they're standing at the top of the hill throwing rocks down at you. You have to make your way up that hill because the landscape's tilted against you. So I just think there's a number of advantages. And those taboos began as liberal and not as radical taboos. They kind of almost happened in a fit of absence of mind around the civil rights movement in the U.S., but actually beginning even before, even in the 50s, there were some, and many of those, you could say at the time it was a good thing that, you couldn't, have racist nursery rhymes, and that was all to the good. But then at some point, this thing kind of overreaches. And all of a sudden, the first instance perhaps of cancel culture in the modern sense is the Moynihan Report on the Black Family of 1965, which was shelved by the Johnson Democrat administration. It clearly had violated a taboo, could be accused by the Congressional Black Caucus of being racist. But really it was pointing to a very real problem, which was the rising fatherlessness in the Black community and its impact. And by the way, the fatherlessness was only about 30% or something quite small by today's standards. But that's just an example, and then that was the beginning. Now, there were fewer such cancellations. There were a few, E.O. Wilson and James Coleman and a few others in the 70s. Coleman for opposing busing, he was kind of canceled on stage. And so you had a couple of these cancellations, but it was already happening, but at a much smaller scale. And then when we get into, there's a bit more of it in the 90s, late 80s, early 90s, and then really explodes with the advent of social media.
And so some of these initial cancellations, are some of them classical liberals in the beginning? Because wouldn't these ideas be percolating up from within their own thought circles?
Yeah, so people like E.O. Wilson, they were canceled by their colleagues in Harvard, for example.
Right.
And though a lot of the people who were canceled would probably consider themselves liberals and Democrats, like James Coleman, for example, the president of the American Sociological Association. I'm 99% sure was a Democrat and a liberal, but also an empiricist and who called the facts as he saw them. And he sort of said, well, it appears that busing is leading to white flight, but this is just an empirical fact in a relationship. And that was seen as a taboo and over the line. And so, yeah, it's within the same liberal circles, and you just had to. So already you could see that temptation to use emotional blackmail and labeling to ostracize around race. Race first, sex didn't come in until later. I mean, I'm trying to think when, maybe Larry Summers. I'm trying to remember when the first cancellation around sexism was, but certainly for race, it happened earlier. Race was the first one. But the power of these sacred, the Holy Trinity, sexuality, gay, that was later. But the power certainly of race already demonstrated in the 60s and 70s. It was just a question of who could wield this kryptonite and start to expand it and start to put more and more things off limits. So in Canada, for example, when I was growing up in the 80s, you could not criticize immigration levels. You couldn't criticize multiculturalism. Those are just two examples of where we think things were radically different. Actually, they weren't that different. Race was already a taboo. Sexism was a taboo. Homophobia. And the boundaries of those words were not fixed. There was no there are no guardrails on what is and is not considered racist. It was simply up to entrepreneurs to stretch those meanings and definitions over time, which they learned to do, and then they followed the logic. I just think the logic was already baked in by the time we're in the 1980s.
Oh, yeah. I've heard people making forth the argument that we're kind of disagreeing at the level of first principles in some ways now. And you mentioned Enlightenment values earlier. Do you see how well does wokeism marry up with the Enlightenment values?
Yeah, it's a tough one because what happens is the Enlightenment produces, liberty, equality, humanitarianism is a bit trickier because it has a kind of Christian root as well. So does egalitarianism. So I think there's the part of the Enlightenment that is kind of liberty and reason. And I think those two things are antithetical to woke, and woke is in conflict with them. And you see that over cancel culture, for example, which is really free speech versus, emotional safety, or if you are more of a pointy head, maybe some kind of critical race or gender ideology. But essentially, there's a clash there between liberty and the woke values. Similarly with reason, if you want to talk about, say, sex as binary, if you want to talk, if you want to challenge the rate at which unarmed Black people are killed in the United States and say, well, it's like 10 to 12 a year, it's not 1,000 a year, or the mass graves, we don't have any evidence for it, it's not a genocide. Any of those kind of claims that are based on reason also are colliding with woke. But then there's, what I think there's kind of like the shadow enlightenment, which is equality and humanitarianism, which are more rooted in versions of Christianity. And I think those are where you can see some of the roots of woke, is the outworking of humanitarianism going into the realm of emotions and psychology and therapy. That is one route. So you get humanistic psychotherapy in the early 1960s. And this is sort of where we get the struggle sessions, the confessionals around guilt, white guilt, male guilt. All of that comes out of that tradition of that humanitarianism going off the deep end through psychotherapy. And that's where we get microaggressions and emotional trauma and all this other stuff. And then equally, we then have egalitarianism, which is part of classical liberalism when it's about equal opportunities for, Jews and Blacks and women and so on, to have the vote, to have civil rights. But when it gets into equal outcomes by discriminating against men and white people in order to achieve some kind of mirror representation, then we're off the reservation and we've moved away from classical liberalism. So I do think the roots of woke, actually the distant roots of woke, probably do lie in Christianity and in the Enlightenment, but more in the kind of equality and humanitarianism stuff rather than in the liberty and reason side of the Enlightenment.
And you speak of this, it sounds more like, the word evil comes up a lot these days. And listening to you talk, you don't sound like someone who thinks that there is like evil people at play here. You see this probably more coming from a genuine desire to bring good into the world.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think people really believe it. I don't think they're just doing it to get ahead in their faculty, to have sinecures for DEI jobs. Now, I'm not saying that, or divide the working class or whatever other theories we have of self-interested theories of woke. I'm not saying there's nothing to those theories. However, I don't think that's the main motivation. I understand probably for some people, yes, it's probably convenient to take somebody down so you can have their job, but I've never subscribed overtly to that kind of Marxist style reasoning. I think it's more people need sources of meaning. This provides a major source of meaning. They strongly identify with this creed, and they're committed to advancing it. I think that is where I'm now. Do they think they're bringing good in the world? Yeah, I think they probably do. I mean, I think there is this, but I would see it at a more basic level that there is this kind of emotional reflex: majority bad, minority good. There's also guilt, white guilt, male guilt, and then there is empathy for sympathetic groups. So it's very much focused on particular groups: Black, Indigenous, women, trans, whatever. It is particular to particular groups and their narratives and struggles that have become romanticized, fetishized, sacralized. And so that's kind of what is behind this. And you're getting people's empathy. And then you're getting also, because of that empathy, hostility to whoever's seen as the oppressor. And so that would be, the flip side of the empathy. And of course, empathy is a very slippery basis for morality, as Paul Bloom in his book, the Yale psychologist in the book Against Empathy, that the flip side of empathy is that you basically can only really focus on a certain number of targets. You screen out, for example, white poor people. They're going to get no empathy because you're focusing your empathy in this direction. And then you're also going to be dehumanizing whoever you think is causing the pain to the group you're empathizing towards. So you're going to start dehumanizing white people and men and conservatives. And so I think this is sort of the way this emotional process works. So I'm much more focusing on this empathy and antipathy towards majority, empathy towards minorities, more emotional. It's empathizing, and it's not the sort of cultural Marxist systematizing. Okay, we failed to have revolution with class. Now we're going to move to identity because that way we think we can bring down capitals. I don't think that is what's going on. I think it's much less the plan, and it's much more people following their emotions and looking for meaning. That's how I kind of theorize this, which is distinct from, a number of others who would put more emphasis on either the intellectuals, like Francis Fukuyama or Yasha Monk, talk a lot about intellectuals and their various somersaults from postmodernism through to strategic essentialism through to critical theory. And Rufo talks about that. I think those things happened, but I think those are justifications for the emotions. I don't think they're drivers. We're not the main drivers of where we are.
And can there be two things true at once? Like, could there be some people who are more buried in academia that are a bit more power focused, and then maybe your average voter who just thinks more emotionally?
Yeah, I think that's why. I think what I think you've got is a number of different. You have some people who are really obviously into high theory about institutional racism, systemic discrimination, patriarchy, all these kind of very academic discourses about power. But I think that, like, if you look at something like Seattle, where just over 50% of the electorate in a poll agreed with defund the police, the height of the George Floyd thing, I think the vast majority of those people are simply emotional. That is, we feel sorry for minorities. We think they're oppressed, and we are hostile to their oppressors, the police, and maybe white males, whatever. So that is at that simple emotional level. I think that's the main driver in terms of the mass support for this. The other thing I'd say is that the woke are also adept at wearing a liberal skin suit, if you like. That is the skin suit, which you would say we believe in liberalism, anti-racism, anti-fascism. We're against sexism. All sounds very much like they're about equal treatment. So you can wear that as the outer skin. So take something like anti-racism. Well, we're anti-racist. That's the outer skin. But inside, it's like, well, you can't just treat people equally. What we have to do is we have to rig the system against whites or against males in order to get an equal outcome. So that's what we're defining as anti-racist. And if you oppose that, you're a racist. So if you oppose affirmative action quotas, you become a racist. So the meaning of what they've done is a kind of Orwellian trick where the outer layer, the label on the tin, means something different to an ordinary person and to a woke individual. So for the ordinary person, they see anti-racism, they think one thing: oh, just don't have race superiority or treat somebody, discriminate on the basis of race. But if you open up the tin, it's about discriminating against white people or Asians in order to ensure 13% black in Harvard. So it's actually it's racism being redefined as anti-racist. So all of these word games, euphemisms, that is the sort of subtle fox-like stealth strategy, the way in which they can manipulate surfaces and labels effectively to achieve political ends. So this is what's going on, right? And what that means is a lot of well-meaning people will be very easily fooled because they don't see past the surfaces, the skin suit. They only see the outside. How can I be against anti-fascism? How can I be against anti-racism or trans rights? How can I be against that without being a racist, transphobe, you name it? So it's very clever, and a lot of well-meaning people who've kind of been raised in an ambient background morality, which is really about that kind of post-Christian care, harm, equality kind of stuff, fall into this. They fall very easily for these surface labels, and they don't really question it. Very clever. And that's why I don't think it's enough just to focus on these woke extremists. You have to also look at the way Western ambient background morality, public morality has evolved, which has enabled these people to move mountains, because it's disarmed much of the population, sucked them into this because they don't know really how to. It's a bit like if you were in a pious Muslim society and you're an Islamic fundamentalist. It's very hard for the pious Muslim to argue against somebody who says, well, look, in the hadith, it says, men and women have to be apart. And it's very, very, very difficult to challenge that if you're already bought into the same meaning system. And I think that's one of the reasons they have such an advantage.
Right, yeah. It does seem like that's one of the why I wanted to kind of focus on Canada and Canadian ideas, is because what I find when I go out into the world and talk with people, I find most people born before, let's say, the year 2000 can't articulate the difference between equity and equality. They can't articulate the difference between anti-racism and the colorblind society ideal. And so I find a lot of my generation and those people are just moving forward as if we're still running on the Enlightenment values, and they're just calling it anti-racism, just saying queer now instead of gay, and they don't actually know what the difference is. And so I'd ask you, like, a lot of this seems to kind of fall back on group identity, like, focusing on not so much on the individual character, but what group you belong to. And you mentioned, equality of outcomes as instead of equality of opportunity. And would it be a stretch to say, like, the history of the 20th century in a lot of ways was this ideological war between individualism, free market democracies, and collectivist, ideas in the 20th? Would it be a stretch to say that this could just be that didn't end like we all thought it did maybe at the turn of the century, and that ideological battle is still kind of manifesting in this form to some degree, or is that too big of a stretch?
Well, that's interesting. I think there are some continuities, but I mean, I don't see it as much as in terms of individual versus collective. I mean, even if we think about identity, it's not the case that this is all about groups and not about individuals. So if you are, a racial minority or a woman or trans or gay, then yeah, it is about your group, and they want you to identify with your group as a way to sort of fight the oppressor. Although, of course, they want you in an artificial political category like BIPOC or LGBTQ, rather than just as your own group with its own identity. But still, those identities are encouraged. But if you are white or male, that identity is suppressed. So actually, it's not about group versus individual. It's about some identities we're going to elevate and boost, and other identities we're going to suppress and repress. And so I don't think collective versus individual is the best way to think about this. It's also the case that within those identities, some are above others. I mean, I think my view is that the racial identities are at the top of the totem pole. They would be sort of king or ace in the pack. A woman might be a sort of an 8 or a 10. It's a bit lower down. It's higher than male, but it's not at the top. And so, if, for example, you will have, a black feminist can accuse white feminists of being racist and break up a feminist movement, or a gay movement can be broken up on race lines. But it's very hard, I think, to break up a black movement if you are female, and say, well, they're sexist, they're black sexist. You don't see that as much. And I think that's telling us something in terms of the power dynamics, which symbols are higher up the totem pole. So in a way, if you're a woman and you're a feminist, but somebody who's trans if they're a 10 and you're an 8 in the pack, they've got more points in this system, then you actually have to defer, and you have to actually suppress. And so actually, it's not really about tribalism. It's about a kind of religion that tells you how many points you have, where you fit in, who you have to stand behind, and then who you can walk on top of. I don't think this is really about identity tribalism, because it doesn't make any sense. Why would a tribal feminist give way to a man in a skirt who wants to enter their space? It just doesn't make any sense from a purely tribal point of view. So it's more of a religion, I would say, where people get capital, what Musa al-Gharbi calls totemic capital, based on how sacred your identity is in the system. I think that's sort of more where the power comes. So the thing about Canada is, and of course, Canada has fallen as hard as almost anywhere else for this, because, it already it was already redefined as a left-wing, particularly a cultural left-wing country after the end of the British Empire. So it was very ripe for any radical progressive ideas coming from the United States to very quickly be implemented. Multiculturalism, which isn't actually an American idea, believe it or not, it comes from the 1910s, Horace Callan and Randolph Bourne and others. So that idea was already institutionalized in Canada in 1971, comes into the Canadian Constitution, as does affirmative action, by the way. So it is legal to discriminate on the basis of race in Canada in the Constitution, and it's not in America. But that tells you something. It was very favorable. A left-wing country is going to be very favorable for the importation of any of these radical ideas. So Canada gets, if others catch a cold, Canada gets the flu. Now, Canada's not the only place. I mean, to some degree, Australia, New Zealand, Ireland, Wales, Scotland, I think all kind of fall into this bucket for various reasons. But all of those places are going to adopt this stuff uncritically. Now, of course, there is also a backlash, but it starts later, and it starts more in a more hesitated way. But I think it is happening in Canada now, partly because of social media, new media, where younger people in particular, are not just listening to the CBC. So they're getting other influences.
So how do you see, how do we dial back, let's say, extremism everywhere? Because it feels like we're in an extremist moment right now. And
Yeah.
how do we just dial back extremism on all sides?
I guess my view is that the excesses of the left are the initial driver, and without taming those, we're not going to be able to dial back the excesses of the right. And the thing is, the excesses of the left have institutional backing and they're trying to present these as natural and normal rather than political, to say that land acknowledgements are just, neutral, what good people do. I mean, it's ridiculous. But that's partly where cultural power comes from, is the ability to say, oh no, this isn't political, this is just natural. It has to be kind of contested, I think, first of all, politically. So we're going to need to see, we're already seeing, we're going to need to have right of center governments. The only right of center governments are going to actually have the mandate to do this, to start pushing back on DEI in the schools and the universities, sort of defunding, but doing it not in a Trumpian arbitrary way, but doing it in a kind of principled way. I think there has to be political leadership. We're seeing it a little bit on the trans issue. In Premier Higgs in New Brunswick started, this idea that you have to inform the parents if you're going to transition, if the kids are transitioning socially in school. Now in Alberta and Saskatchewan, that will have to happen in more places, and probably to the extent federal government has power, certainly power over the purse. They've got to use this to try and disincentivize culture, what I would call cultural socialism, which is taken over from cultural liberalism. That has to become a major crusade. Likewise, I think some attempt to end racial discrimination in hiring, in sentencing, and all of these areas, the corruption of which, to be fair, maybe the Constitution is going to need to be amended, or new guidance issued, new judges appointed. It's going to be a long battle, but the right is going to have to get serious about culture, much more serious, and not just take the safe road and just talk about tax cuts. So that has to happen, but also, I think, cultural resistance, where you can resist, do resist, don't wear the rainbow flag, don't, wherever you can resist reasonably without getting yourself turfed out of a job.
Right, yeah.
Yeah. So these are the things. It's just a game of inches on the culture. But certainly there are a lot of things governments, if they get into power, can do. There's so many policies. Schools having to put all their materials online, for example, curriculum transparency, universities must declare themselves politically neutral to get government money. I would say no more DEI in. Well, you can do it two ways. I mean, you can either ban DEI in, say, government grants, or you can say anything you do for race and sex, you got to match on politics and ideology. So if you want to try and have and say, well, we're going to have X percent indigenous and black for research grants, you're going to have X percent conservative, matching the population. And that what that will do is it will just naturally make, people are not going to want to advertise jobs just for conservatives. So they're probably going to dial back the race and sex stuff.
Right.
Yeah, so I think there are different tools, quite a few policies that I think people have come up with that can be used by governments, but it's going to have to be overtly politicized. So the woke want to keep the stuff in the shadows away from democratic politics. They want to say you're being divisive as a way of keeping the spotlight away from their cultural revolution. So if you resist the cultural revolution, you're a cultural warrior and you're fomenting division. That is their technique, because if you look at Canadian public opinion, it's 2-1 against the woke position on average. So something like removing John A. Macdonald's statue from public spaces, that's opposed like 2-1. And yet it's happened in pretty much every city because there's no political mobilization for the 2/3. And you can see something similar on the trans issue. You can see something similar on free speech issues. It's going to take a much more assertive politics and much more culturally focused politics to elevate these issues. If Mark Carney wants to defend, or if the Liberal Party, for example, wants to defend the trans activist agenda, which is the de facto agenda in Canada, put him on the spot and say, what is a woman? Do you think that a biological male should be in a women's prison? Here's some examples. Do you support that? Really nail them and make them say it, and then get that into ads. I mean, that has to start to happen. They'll say, "Oh, divisive, playing the culture war." No, that is their tactic for trying to disarm you so you don't come to battle. They want you to bring, a knife to a gunfight. You have to start to sort of see through the kind of Gramscian strategy that's being waged by the other side and not fall for it. And I think a lot of parties of the right in Canada have fallen for it. They've kind of wanted to play nice, and they've kind of been duped for that reason.
Why do you think that is? If you're saying these are such popular, there seems to be so many social issues out right now that are just so heavily weighted with the majority believing this one way. That's usually like easy scores for politicians. They're usually lining up well, why is it even right of center politicians aren't lining up and taking those wins?
Because, yeah, you're absolutely right. There'd be easy victories. But the elite the elite political culture, it creates its own set of norms in parliament, in media. And if you violate those, so what they're trying to do is take these issues off the democratic table for debate and make them taboo. If you violate that, if you kind of make them an issue, the cultural left will accuse you of being, if it's about race, you're a racist. If it's about trans, you're transphobe. So they'll trot out these labels to try and shut you down. So you have to be willing to violate taboos, which means you're probably not going to get invited to certain dinner parties. You're probably not going to be invited onto certain media. But if you're not breaking taboos and being disinvited, you're probably not actually doing your job. So you need by definition, you will need a more populist style of conservatism. Now, I do think that in Canada, Poilievre is bringing that more populist style. Whether he will, if he gets elected, big M, whether he will follow through on these things and have that, you have to have an adversarial stance against the media, who are all essentially dominated by the progressive left as well. No, I don't think you should just be arbitrary and vindictive like a Trump, but I think you should try and make it principled. Try and explain why, for example, affirmative action is not anti-racism. You have to be very clear about what you mean and why these things are not. Going against affirmative action is actually the anti-racist position. But you have to fight those battles, and you have to break through these taboos which have been erected in elite political culture. And that's what's been so difficult. You look at Higgs in New Brunswick when he sort of said, we're not going to let schools just transition kids. Half of his party, and he's on the right, conservative, half of them didn't want anything to do with it. It just shows you the power of these, because they knew that in polite society they would be sort of tarred with this radioactive brush. And that's the genius really of these taboos, is they compel even small minorities can move mountains. And it's really going to take somebody who doesn't care, who's willing to, and I think that culture is emerging in Canada and it's in Australia and other places where you're going to need a more populist style politics that is less beholden to those elite norms. Now, the tricky thing is you do need norms. You do need civil norms. You don't want a Trump style, but that's a very tough balance to strike. We need the populism to disrupt norms that have been captured and corrupted by the woke left. You need to kind of break norms in order to but you then want to, I think it's important to explain what you're doing, not just to sort of, just do it. But I think you need to explain it so that you can kind of reclaim and reappropriate these liberal labels like anti-racism for real anti-racism and not for what is effectively kind of race communism or race socialism where it's all about equal outcomes. So yeah, this is a sort of complicated battle, but I think it's definitely going to define politics going forward because, the culture war is about a lot more than the culture. If you insist on equal outcomes, then you have to have, if you want equal outcomes in jail and in school, then you can't do crime prevention properly. You can't deport people because that's racism. So you can't do border control. You can't do education because you can't exclude pupils if there's a racial disparity in the number of people excluded. So there's it actually cascades throughout the system. So many of the problems that are mounting in Canada, and especially in urban areas, or even problems on Indigenous reserves, I mean, these are all in many cases compounded and worsened by the woke agenda. So in order to fix them, you can't ignore the woke aspect. A lot of the population doesn't understand that. They only see the effects, the symptoms of the disease. They don't see the actual disease itself. But you actually can't just address the symptoms without dealing with the disease.
That's why it maybe does feel like the free speech is still maybe our best tool here in just getting conversation going. Because I do often think that, like, if you turn on the mainstream media today and just see what's going on down south, commonly people say to me, like, well, why are you talking about gender right now? Why are you talking about this and that? It just feels all like small potatoes compared to the crises unfolding in the world. And I think it does require a little bit more dialogue to kind of explain why these ideas are important. And they're not just like whimsical complaints or grievances, but they're actually tied to the deeper concepts you talk about and teach about. And I'm just conscious of our time running up here. So start wrapping up here, Eric. But yeah, if people are looking to look further into your work and what you talk about, where can they find your stuff?
Well, yeah, you can go to, I've got a website. I put everything up there, www.sneps.net. And which, by the way, is a corruption of, remember Harold Sneps on the Vancouver Canucks stuff. Anyway, but it's not spelled exactly like that. It's sneps.net. And then also my Twitter handle at EPKAUFM. So yeah, just check those out, and you'll find links to everything I'm doing.
And is there anything else in the context of the conversation? Anything else you want to leave us with, or say that?
Well, I'm also involved in trying to reform academia in a kind of post-progressive direction. So I have this research center for heterodox social science because really the whole production of knowledge has been completely warped by, first of all, the fact that the social sciences and social research is 12, 15 to 1 left to right. Plus you've got these taboos about what you're not allowed to research. So we're not actually getting proper knowledge production. So I've got this center for heterodox social science at the University of Buckingham, which is a reasonably independent university in Britain. And I'm interested in this concept of whether we're moving into the end of the cultural progressive period from the 60s to the 2020s, and that serious people are now starting to rethink, when they see tent cities and they see, polarization, and that maybe it's time to start, like senior elite people.
Unfortunately, we lost Eric's audio at this point, but I'll include links to his work in the show notes if you'd like to explore further. Thank you for listening. If you'd like to support the show, please visit our donations page or subscribe and share with friends. The Canadians, working class roots, a free speech lens, Canadian contrarians.